Friends, Romans, and countrymen, or just friends, let's say. Uh, Yesterday, I was reading the diary of Richard Cox, and I got to a point where I'd read for over an hour, and an AI window popped up, and actually, I couldn't progress any further with the reading, which might have been just as well because the reading was rather long, and I think it's better to start again with the preface of this edition, uh, which I have on PDF, and I'll start again and read just the preface. So I think that's probably the best thing to do. Right. First of all, I have to share uh, these PDFs. Now, I have two alternative ways of reading. I can either read from this uh, file, which is I've just downloaded from the Internet Archive.org, or I can read from this, which is what I've scanned. I've actually scanned the paperback, which I just showed you. And I think that much as I like the yellow background, I think it's easier to see on a screen if I read from this black and white one. So I think what I shall do is go to the start of this particular file and read from here. All right, so here it is. Works issued by the Hakluyt Society, Diary of Richard Cox, number 66. And I think we can make it a little bit easier to see if we get rid of all the sort of bits and bobs. Get rid of that. Don't want that. Right. All right, we're ready to go now. Good. Yeah, Council of the Hakluyt Society, we will pass over. Diary of Richard Cox, Cape Merchant in the English factory in Japan, 1615 to 1622, with correspondence. Cape Merchant actually just means chief merchant. Um, and the correspondence, there's quite a lot of letters at the back of volume 2. And also there's an index at the back of that volume. But as I've pointed out already, this edition by Edward Maund Thompson is not a complete transcription of the diaries because he has omitted stuff that he thought wasn't important, details about the price of commodities and stuff like that. But anyway, he's done 2 volumes, and his preface is rather interesting and has been commended by the editors of the Japanese edition, uh, published in 1979 to 80. And I also think it's rather good. So let's begin with the preface by Edward Maund Thompson, later Sir Edward Maund Thompson, 1840 to 1929, I think. British Museum. He worked at the British Museum, and this preface is from the British Museum. Okay. The history of the English trading settlement in Japan in the first quarter of the 17th century is the history of a failure, and the causes of the failure are not far to seek. Choosing for their depot an insignificant island in the extreme west of the kingdom, without even good anchorage to recommend it, and at a far distance from the capital cities of Miyako and Edo, Kyoto and Tokyo now, with the Dutch for their neighbours, and as it proved, their rivals, the English may be said to have courted disaster. It is true that Firando, that's Hirado, west of Kyushu, uh, was a ready port for shipping coming from Europe. Its ruler was friendly, and it lay in a convenient position from whence to open the much desired trade with China. The daimyo was Matsura. That was the ruler in question, the Matsura family. And the policy of making common cause with the Protestant Hollanders, the Dutch, against the Spaniards and Portuguese, who had first secured a footing in Japan and were powerful in the neighboring town of Nagasaki, would have been a sound one had the latter remained supreme. But when the English landed, the Dutch had already obtained privileges and had established their trade in the country, and what ought to have been foreseen inevitably came to pass. The Dutch were not allies, they were rivals who undersold the English in the market and in the end starved them out of the country. Possibly, if our countrymen had been allowed to maintain the branch factories which they started in some of the principal towns, they might have held their own against their rivals, in spite of the limited trade which Japan afforded. But when their privileges were curtailed and they were restricted to Hirado, their case became desperate. Purchas, in his Pilgrims, has told us the story of the first landing of the English and its causes. The present volumes give us the internal history of the factory, the factory being the trading outpost. The original diary of Richard Cox, the chief factor, the chief agent in charge of the factory, once formed part of those papers of the East India Company, whose luckless fate it was to be destroyed or cast out of their home in Leadenhall Street to wander through the world. Happily, the diary escaped many perils and now rests in the British Museum, where, bound in 2 volumes, it bears the numbers additional manuscripts 31,300, 31,301. Unfortunately, it is not complete. It runs from 1st of June 1615 to 14th of January 1619, and from 5th of December 1620 to 24th of March 1622, but it has lost nothing since it left the company's archives. I will omit that footnote. I have thought it necessary, I have not thought it necessary to print the whole of it, but only those entries which have absolutely no interest. For example, bare memoranda of sales and purchases have been omitted. As a supplement to illustrate the diary and to fill in the periods which are wanting therein, I have added in an appendix a selection from the letters of Cox and others, chiefly from the archives of the India Office. Our early connection with Japan forms perhaps one of the most interesting episodes in our mercantile history, and has a share of romance imparted to it by the story of the English sailor whose name is so intimately associated with it. William Adams, a Kentish man born in a town called Gillingham, 2 English miles from Rochester, 1 mile from Chatham, where the king's ships do lie, a seafaring man who had served in the English Navy, joined as senior pilot one of the Dutch trading fleets which sailed for the East in 1598. Weighing anchor in June, Adams and his companions encountered misfortune and delay on the coast of Africa, so that it was not till April of the next year that they reached the Straits of Magellan, where they were forced to pass the winter. Hence they made for Peru, and after sundry adventures in which the fleet was dispersed, and the Charity, the Dutch name was Liefde, the ship wherein Adams sailed, lost the greater part of her crew. The latter vessel, in company with a single consort, struck across for Japan. But bad fortune still waited on the unlucky voyagers. The consort foundered in a storm, and Adams' ship with difficulty reached the shores of the province of Bungo in the island of Kyushu, from where I am speaking now, in Japan, where she let fall her anchor on the 19th of April 1600. Her crew was reduced to 24 all told, and of these only some half-dozen were able to stand on their feet. Of the latter, Adams was one, and was selected to be sent up to the court of Ieyasu, the famous soldier who then ruled Japan. That's Tokugawa Ieyasu. The moment at which Adams set foot in this unknown land was a critical one in the history of the country. The dual form of government by Mikado and Shogun had been in existence some 400 years. In the 12th century, at a time when Japan was torn by internal wars and dissensions, the military chief Yoritomo had risen to power and, overthrowing his enemies, had set up the military despotism which, acting in the name of the powerless Mikado, ruled the whole country. In 1192, Yoritomo received from the Mikado the title of Sei Tai Shogun, barbarian subjugating great general, and henceforth that title was transmitted to the de facto rulers and lasted down to the Revolution of 1868. The Mikado, the rightful emperor of Japan, became a mere cipher living in the seclusion of his palace, neglected and often in poverty, living in Kyoto, or Miyako as it was. And we would think of him as the emperor. We don't use the word Mikado these days. This peculiar system has naturally perplexed foreigners, and thus it is that the Mikado, or Dairi as he is more usually called by the early European writers, is represented as the spiritual head, while the shogun, or military ruler for the time being, is always styled the emperor. Well, not nowadays, but there we are. Two families, the Hojo and the Ashikaga, successively held the shogunate down to the year 1573. The last shogun of the second house was deposed by Nobunaga, that's Oda Nobunaga, the son of a soldier of fortune, whose name, like those of his two generals and successors, Toyotomi Hideyoshi and Tokugawa Ieyasu, is great in Japanese history. Nobunaga fell the victim of treachery, but his place was promptly filled by Hideyoshi, who at once crushed the rising which had overthrown his master and assumed the reins of government. The son of a peasant, he had entered Nobunaga's service as a groom, but attracting notice, he was promoted to military service and quickly rose by his own prowess to high command. Often changing his name according to Japanese custom, he appears in history under many designations. By the Portuguese Jesuits, he is referred to as Fashiba, i.e. Hashiba, but he is more generally known by his later name of Taiko-sama, and by this name he is called in these volumes. Neither he nor Nobunaga received the title of shogun. The highest rank to which he attained was that of Kuambaku, or premier. Hideyoshi died in 1598, leaving an infant son, Hideyori, the Fidaya-sama of COCKS's diary, whom he had married to the granddaughter of his old fellow soldier Ieyasu, in the hope of thus disarming a dangerous rival who was also appointed one of the guardians of the boy. But these precautions went for nothing. Even in Nobunaga's days, Ieyasu was a powerful leader, and he had only submitted to Taiko-sama after some hesitation. It is true that he swore to protect the interests of the young Hideyori, but many circumstances combined to stifle any scruples that he might have felt in supplanting his ward. It was whispered that the child was no son of Taiko-sama, and even if he were, the nobles who had resented the rule of the low-born chief, whom they were forced to obey, were not disposed to continue their submission to his child. What has always happened in such conjunctures was sure to happen now. The other guardians of the young prince, suspicious of Ieyasu, began to draw together their troops. Ieyasu summoned his men, and soon after, in October 1600, the rival armies confronted each other on the field of Sekigahara, near Lake Biwa, in the center of the kingdom. Ieyasu gained a decisive victory. His enemies were scattered with fearful slaughter, and the young Hideyori was at the mercy of the conqueror. To the credit of the latter, his captive received no harm, but continued to lead a life of almost perfect freedom in his strong castle of Osaka. It was then only a few months before this decisive battle that Adams had his first interview with Ieyasu, the emperor as he styles him, at Osaka. How he found favor in his eyes, was taken into his confidence, learned him some points of geometry and understanding of the arts of mathematics, built him ships, and in fine, I think that should be in time, gained such influence that what I said he would not contrary, Adams himself has told us in that letter which, a captive in a far-off land, he addressed so pathetically to his unknown friends and countrymen. But when, in his yearning to see wife and children again, according to conscience and nature, he prayed for liberty to return to his country, Ieyasu hardened his heart and would not let him go. The most that was granted was leave for the Dutch captain of the ship and one of the crew to depart. The Dutch captain rejoiced in the name of Quackernack. This they did, and it should be noted that it was by the help of the daimyo of Firando, Hirado, who now first appears upon the scene, that they found a junk wherein to sail. The captain was soon after killed fighting against the Portuguese. His companion returned and settled at Nagasaki, being the Melchior van Zandvoort or Zandvoort, whom we met in the diary. Others of the crew no doubt settled in the country. One of them is incidentally mentioned by COCKS, Volume 1, page 171. Adams's letter above referred to was written in October 1611. It reached the English factory at Bantam probably early in 1612, but the idea of opening trade with Japan had already been entertained in England. Adams's story was known there by reports from the Dutch, and letters announcing the intentions of the East India Company were sent out to him by the ship Globe, which sailed in January 1611. In April following, the Clove, the Thomas, and the Hector were dispatched under command of Captain John Saris, with letters from King James I to the Emperor of Japan. Arriving at Bantam in October 1612, Saris remained there till the beginning of the new year, and then, on the 14th of January, sailed for Japan in the ship Clove with a crew of some 70 men. On the 10th of June, off Nagasaki, he first sighted the western coast of Kyushu, and 2 days after came to an anchor in the haven of Hirado. The first to greet the English commander were the old daimyo or tono, Hoin-sama, that's Hoin-sama, then in his 72nd year, and his grandson, a young man of 22, who shared the government. Both are styled kings, and the latter is Figen-a or Figeno-sama, who appears throughout Cox's diary as the king of Hirado. Hoin-sama or Hoin-sama seems to have been a simple and unaffected old man, not averse to merrymaking, but firm, and says Saris famed to be the worthiest soldier of all Japan for his valor and service in the Korean Wars. See Purchas's Pilgrims, Volume 1, page 369. Old as he was and good-humoured as he appeared, we see something of the sterner side of his character in certain remarks of our diarist. Almost immediately after their arrival, the English sailors began quarrelling and drew from him a reproof which, though gentle, was a sufficient hint. And we are told at a later date, when his dog Balla was accidentally killed by the English cook, that if this had happened in the time of Foin-sama, who esteemed this dog much, it might have cost us all our lives. Volume 1, page 248. The readiness with which he welcomed and encouraged foreign trade is creditable, and proves that he understood, at all events in some degree, the benefits which his small principality might derive from it. He died in 1614, about a year after the establishment of the English factory. The young king had not the force of character of his grandfather. Though generally keeping on fair terms with the English, his temper was capricious, and he was probably too indolent not to be ruled by his own ministers, some of whom appear to have been all-powerful. The principal nobles and ministers at Hirado were Bongo-sama or Nobe-sana, Hoin's brother and consequently great-uncle to Figena-sama, Tonomon-sama and Genta or Gentero-sama, Figena-sama's brothers, of whom the first acted as viceroy in the absence of the king, and the second resided as hostage at the shogun's court, and was in favour there. Sangero-sama, a natural son of Foin, Oyen-dono and Semi-dono, the royal secretaries, and Takamon-dono, the chief justice, our enemy, as Cox calls him, volume 2, page 3. So Oyen-dono, this is probably more a title than a name, as another Oyen-dono appears as secretary to the shogun. The Dutch had already been settled in Firando, for some years. In July 1609, their ship, the Red Lion, arrived in that port, and, favoured by Foin-sama, they succeeded in obtaining from the shogun leave to establish a factory and to send one or more ships annually from Europe. It was not, however, till 2 years after this that another small ship, the Brach, arrived, and 2 commissioners were sent up to pay the usual visit to the court. One of these was Jacob Speck, also called Specs or Specx by other writers. afterwards head of the Dutch factory and the contemporary and rival of COCKS. At the court at Suruga in Shizuoka, they were met by William Adams, whose influence with the shogun was used to such good purpose that they received most favorable terms for trading in the country, while two embassies of the Portuguese and Spaniards, which were present about the same time, failed to obtain the full privileges they sought. The head of the Dutch factory, when Saris landed, was Hendrik Brouwer, and at the very first mention of his name by COCKS, the jealousy which was smouldering in the hearts of the two nations shows itself. Captain Brouwer went along by the door, but would not look at us, and we made as little account of him. Purchase, Volume 1, page 396. The first business for Saris to transact was the hire of a house to serve for a factory, a trading post, from Captain Andassi, captain of the China quarter, the Chinaman who appears all through the diary by the name of Andrea Dittis. His next was to prepare to visit the court of Ieyasu, only waiting to be joined by William Adams, for whom he had sent and who arrived on the 29th of July. They started on their journey on the 7th of August, leaving COCKS to manage affairs at Hirado, and travelled by the same regular route over which COCKS was afterwards so often to pass, down the inland sea to Osaka, and thence by land to Suruga, the modern Shizuoka, where Ieyasu resided, and afterwards proceeding to Yedo to visit Hidetada, the son of the latter and actual shogun, to whom his father, according to a not infrequent custom, had transferred the title in 1605. It is needless to repeat here the interesting details of this journey, which are to be found in Saris's own narrative in the pages of Purchas. For our present purpose, it is enough to state that the travellers returned to Firando on the 6th of November with ample privileges for trade. One request was, however, refused, viz. The right to bring into Japan and sell the goods of Chinese prizes, which might be captured as a punishment for rejection of the English trade. This is only one of several instances that are recorded of Ieyasu's fairness to all foreigners alike, and of his refusal to mix in their quarrels. It was also understood that, on the arrival of a ship from Europe, a present was to be carried to the shogun, and for trade with neighbouring countries a goshon or license was requisite for each junk that sailed. Now, touching a factory to be left there, says Saris, I had on the 26th of November assembled my merchandising council, whereupon these considerations, viz. The encouragement we had received in the Moluccas by private intelligence, the Dutch factory already planted here in Firando, the large privileges now obtained of the Emperor of Japan, the certain advice of the English factories settled in Siam and Patane, the commodities resting unsold upon our hands appointed for these parts, and the hoped-for profit which further experience may produce, it was resolved that a factory should be left there, viz. 8 English, 3 Japan juribasses or interpreters, and 2 servants who were appointed against the coming of the next ships to search and discover the coast of Korea, Tushme, that's Tsushima, I think, and other parts of Japan, and countries thereunto adjoining, to see what good might be done in any of them. Purchase, Volume 1, page 379. The 8 Englishmen who were thus appointed members of the English factory were Richard COCKS, captain and cape or head merchant, William Adams, Tempest Peacock, Richard Wickham, William Eaton, Walter Cowarden, Edmund Sayers, and William Neilson. Richard COCKS was probably a native of Coventry. At all events, he was familiar with that city, Volume 1, page 172, and had friends there, Volume 1, page 229. His name appears in the Charter of Incorporation of the East India Company, 31st December 1600, and in the earlier list of names of such persons as have written with their own hands to venture in the pretended voyage to the East Indies, 22nd of September 1599, he is described as a grocer and subscribes £200. It's quite a lot of money in those days, no doubt. He himself tells us, Volume 2, page 317, that besides being a member of this right honourable and right worshipful society or company which trades to the East Indies, in other words, the East India Company, He belonged to the merchants adventurers and was made free of the old Hanse. Now, I wonder if that is to do with had anything to do with the Hanseatic League, or if it's just a misspelling. I don't know. And he was also a member of the Clothworkers' Company. A certain Richard Cox, who sailed with Frobisher in his third voyage to Meta Incognita in 1578, and who was distinguished as the first to sail in among the ice, was probably a relative. From 1603 to 1608, he lived at Bayonne in France, no doubt as a merchant. Many newsletters written by him from thence are preserved in the Public Record Office, addressed to Sir Thomas Wilson, Secretary to Lord Treasurer Salisbury. From this we may infer that Sir Thomas was Cox's patron. The correspondence was continued when Cox was in Japan, and some of his letters, which dwelt on the wonders of the country, were sent to King James to read, who declared them to contain the loudest lies that he had ever heard. Gosh. That's James the First of England and James the Sixth of Scotland, the one and the same man, of course. Wilson pronounces the writer to be, though not lettered, a man of honesty, years, and judgment. As Cox becomes well known to us as we read his diary, we will leave him for the present. Of the other members of the factory, two soon disappeared from the scene. Tempest Peacock and Walter Cowarden went on a trading venture to Cochinchina, that's the southern part of Vietnam, and as we shall see, never returned. Richard Wickham appears to have been in more independent circumstances than the rest. Even before Saris's departure, he began to give trouble, as his time of agreement with the company had nearly expired, and he bargained for higher wages. He resigned his place and left Japan early in 1618, and died soon after at Jakarta in Java. Could that be Jakarta? Worth, it was said, £5,000 or £6,000. William Eaton and Edmund Sayers, incorrectly named Edward Saris in Saris's narrative, Purchas, Volume 1, page 379. Okay. Edmund Sayers were with the factory from first to last. Eaton and Sayers, that is. The former is called by Cox my countrymen, probably meaning that they were natives of the same place or district. William Neilson was turbulent and quarrelsome, particularly when drink put him into his fustian fumes. He died in March 1620, being wasted away with a consumption. After reading of their constant bickerings, one smiles to find that he made Cox his heir, and piously adds Cox, if God had called me in his mercy before Mr. Neilson, then had he had as much of mine. Volume 2, page 321. So if Cox had died before Neilson, he would have done the same for Neilson, apparently. When Adams accompanied Saris to court, he had at length got leave from Ieyasu to visit his native land. Why he did not choose to sail in the Clove, as he at first intended, was, he himself tells us, because of some discourtesies offered me by the general. That would be Saris. In fact, Saris seems to have disagreed with him on several points and did not treat him generously. But perhaps a better reason for his stay was that which Cox gives, that he was loath to return to his country a beggar. For although Ieyasu had given him an estate of some extent, he was ill provided with money. And yet another and nobler reason may have influenced him. In my simple judgment, he says in one of his letters, if the Northwest Passage be ever discovered, it will be discovered by this way of Japan. And Cox adds, Mr. Adams is of the opinion that if ever the northeast or northwest passages be found out, it must be from these parts, and offereth his best services therein, the Emperor promising his best furtherance, with men or letters of recommendation to all princes, and hath entrance already into an island called Yezo, that's Hokkaido, which is thought to be rather some part of the continent of Tartaria. Volume 2, page 258. The continent of Tartaria is yeah. I've not heard of that before. I think there might be another reason that he didn't want to face the music with his English wife and children. But there we are. Who knows? It's hard to tell at this distance. So Adams took service with the company after some haggling over the amount of his wages for 2 years. One shouldn't forget that he also had the Japanese wife and two children by this time, and constantly appears in the course of the diary in various employments. Cox was evidently a little afraid of him, and while praising him to the company as tractable and willing to do your worships the best service he may, he cautions Wickham to have a due care to give Captain Adams content, which you may easily do if you use him with kind speeches, and fall not into terms with him upon any argument. I am persuaded, he adds, I could live with him 7 years before any extraordinary speeches should happen betwixt us. Our Cox doth protest too much. Adams's friendliness to his old comrades, the Dutch, is ever a thorn in the side of the Cape merchant. I cannot choose but note it down that both I myself and all the rest of our nation do see that he is much more friend to the Dutch than to the Englishmen, which are his own countrymen, God forgive him. But in spite of occasional outbursts of this nature, they lived generally on friendly terms, and there is no reason to doubt the sincerity of Cox's sorrow when his comrade died. Two others joined the factory at a later date. John Oosterwyk, of Dutch descent and a kinsman of Wickham, came out in 1615 and remained to the end. Richard Hudson, whom Cox in 1617 calls a boy, and who had lost his father and brother in the search for the Northwest Passage, I think that's where we get Hudson Bay from, was employed as an unattached servant at the factory. Saris sailed from Japan on the 5th of December 1613. The merchandise which stocked the factory consisted chiefly of broadcloth and woolen and cotton piece goods, also of bantam pepper, gunpowder, lead, tin, etc. Its total value was about £5,650. The company was sanguine enough on Saris's representation to hope for such success in the Japan trade as to be able to export silver in sufficient quantity to maintain their Indian trade. But Saris's estimate of the mercantile prospects was based on false premises. When he arrived, the prices of imports were extraordinarily high, but then the Dutch had the market nearly all to themselves, and the demand for European goods was almost too limited to give room for competition. Steel and lead alone among metals and silk among materials sold readily. Saris indeed had tried to arrange with the Dutch factor on a profitable price at which both nations should sell their cloth, but the latter immediately shipped away great store of cloth to divers islands, rating them at base prices that he might procure the more speedy dispatch of his own, and glut the place before the coming of ours. Purchase Volume 1 through page 369. But even apart from Dutch competition, cloth was not a favourite article of trade in Japan. Saris soon found that the natives were backward in buying, especially when they saw that the English themselves did not wear the material they recommended. For, said they, you commend your cloth unto us, but you yourselves wear least thereof, the better sort of you wearing silken garments, the meaner fustians. Cox, too, naively remarked that the people of Japan are so addicted to silks that they do not enter into consideration of the benefit of wearing cloth. Volume 2, page 259. On the other hand, if cloth happened to rise in price, it at once commanded a sale among the wealthy, Wickham in one of his letters noticing the disposition of the Japanese, especially of the better sort, to buy those commodities which are most rare and when they are dearest. Spanish cloth, he says, never sold better than when it was high in price. When it fell, no one would look at it. When it again reached a high price, it recovered its reputation. Again, when warlike rumours were afloat, there was a demand for cloth, as it was used for cases for arms. And so, we are told, the Japanese preferred good measure to fine quality. Sober colours were generally preferred. Venice red and flame colour would not sell at all in 1614. In 1620, blacks and reds are in fashion, volume 2, page 311. Indian cloths sold not so much for necessity as for the new and strange fashions and paintings thereof, the Japanese being a people desiring change, volume 2, page 273. After Saris's departure, however, the English factory lost no time in attempting to establish trade in the country. At the beginning of the new year, Wickham was sent as agent to Yedo, Eaton was stationed at Osaka, and Sayers had a commission to the northern parts of Kyushu and the neighboring island of Tsushima, the first step to trade with Korea. It is, in fact, between Japan and Korea. In Cox's letters to Wickham, we see the anxiety caused by the competition of the Dutch. Wickham was to sell away, although something under cento per cento, and not to be outstripped by his rivals. A junk was also fitted out with a cargo worth £750 to trade to Cochinchina, southern Vietnam. Tempest Peacock going in her as merchant, 18th of March 1614, with Walter Cawarden to assist him. This venture was unfortunate. Peacock was killed in Cochinchina, treacherously as it appeared, and Cawarden was cast away on the return voyage. Although 2 attempts were subsequently made by Adams to renew intercourse, neither succeeded. Trade with Siam was also opened, a junk being at once bought and commissioned for the purpose. Adams showed skill and energy in fitting her for her voyage and took the command in her first trip, which however failed, owing principally to the mutinous conduct of the crew. This venture was estimated at £1,400. But the country with which the English most coveted commercial relations was China, and through all the diary and correspondence of Cox, negotiations are always in progress. 'Twas ever thus, it appears, since we still covet those. The 2 Chinese traders, Andrea Dittis, the landlord of the English house mentioned above, and his brother Huo, who was stationed at Nagasaki, were the agents through whom Cox hoped to obtain a footing in China, where also a third brother was supposed to be negotiating with the authorities to obtain the desired privileges. And not inconsiderable sums were advanced to smooth the way. But China was then in a state of war and confusion, and although in the end, after years of waiting, Cox was told that permission for trade was granted, no charter or other documents arrived, and in any case, it was then at the moment when the English were preparing to withdraw from Japan, too late to do anything. The English factory then had been established about 2 years in June 1615, the date at which Cox's diary begins. The house which had been hired of the China captain had been purchased and improved at a cost of nearly £600. Foin-sama had been dead some 12 months, and Figena-sama reigned in his stead. Captain Broer had disappeared from the Dutch factory to make room for Jacob Speck, and we are at once carried into the midst of native affairs. On the 2nd of June, reports reached Hirado of the total defeat of the young Prince Hideyori, Fidaya-sama, by Ieyasu. As we have already seen, Hideyori had been left in comparative freedom after the Battle of Sekigahara. He had now grown to man's estate and had the sympathy of a large part of the country. And Cox especially notices that the people of the southern parts affect the young man more than the old. Round him gathered all who had reason to fear or dislike his rival, and when the final rupture took place, he had a following of 120,000 men. There can be little doubt that the young prince perished in the burning castle of Osaka after the total defeat of his troops. But the fact that his body could not be found was enough to give rise to the rumor that he had escaped. His followers were hunted down and destroyed, but that he still lived was widely believed, and that belief lasted for years and is frequently noticed in these pages. Apolinario Franco, a Franciscan who was present at the terrible scene at Osaka, escaped to Hirado and is mentioned early in the diary. Notwithstanding his Protestant dislike of priests and friars, Cox could not refuse Christian charity to one in such sore distress. We meet with him once or twice again. He died at the stake in Omura, that's Nagasaki Prefecture, in 1622. Not too far from Hirado, in fact. After the destruction of Osaka, the shoguns adopted the policy of detaining for stated periods at court the daimyos of the several provinces or some members of their families. This arrangement is often noticed by Cox. At the end of August arrived the ship Ozianda or Hosianda from England, and Captain Ralph Coppindale was sent up to court with a customary present. In a letter written after his return to Firando, he records the unprofitable nature of the trade of Japan. Either we must procure a peaceable trade in China, or else, as the Hollanders, the Dutch, do, to trade with them perforce. And if we set foot in the Moluccas, this place, that's the Spice Islands, this place will be a fit storehouse from whence we may always have men, munition, and victuals good store, and at reasonable rates. Volume 2, page 271. These indeed were also sentiments of the factors and were repeated more than once. A quarrel with the Portuguese and Spaniards at Nagasaki, who had seized and imprisoned 2 of their own countrymen for serving the English, is among the events of this year. And however much they might disagree among themselves, English and Dutch were at one when attacking or attacked by the other 2 rival nations, so that the capture of a Portuguese junk by the Dutch and her condemnation through Adam's influence at court as good prize gave unmixed satisfaction at Hirado. In connection with this capture, an interesting conversation between Ieyasu and Adams is recorded, Volume 2, page 276. So these parts of the diary are being highlighted, the references given. Early in 1616, a report began to circulate that Ieyasu was dead. COCKS, with the caution with which he had learned to regard all Japanese news, rather viewed it as a fable given out of purpose to see how people would take the matter. And he, no doubt, only expresses the general feeling when he adds, "Once the old man is subtle." In June, the king of Hirado is reported to have visited him, the daimyo that is, but was only permitted to enter into his chamber, where they say he lay sick in a little cabin covered with paper. And soon after it was known that he had really expired. He is said to have died from the effects of a wound received at the storming of Osaka. See Titsing's Annales, edited Klaproth, Paris, 1834, page 406. He had really expired, not, however, before he had had the satisfaction of having his physician cut in pieces. Oh, no. COCKS, however, was hard of belief, found that hard to believe, and was convinced that he will soon rise again if any wars be moved against his son within these 3 years. This son was the shogun Hidetada, a man very different from his father in his manner of regarding foreigners. It was now necessary for the English to send up a deputation to court for a confirmation of privileges under the new reign, and the ships Thomas and Advice arriving from England just at the time, COCKS got ready his presents and started at the end of July in company with Adams, who had just returned from Siam. The account of the journey to Edo and the audience with the shogun is very interesting, but they did not obtain what they sought. The privileges were curtailed, and the English were restricted to the single port of Hirado. In vain did COCKS petition to have this decision reversed, and although the shogun's secretaries Kotskin Dono and Oyen Dono did not seem to be unfavourable, they declared that it was impossible to alter matters. Inga Dono, also the Chief Justice, could only tell COCKS that at present all matters were in other manner in Japan than in time of the old emperor, and common report declared that no man dared speak to the emperor of any matter they think is to his discontent. He is so furious, and no means but death and destruction. Volume 1, page 186, 187. In the end, the English had to withdraw all their factors from Yedo, Miyako, Sakai, and Osaka. Yeah, quite a blow for them, and the beginning of the end of the trade. There is a long footnote. Let me see, should we go back for it? Following extract from a letter of COCKS is given as coming from damaged papers, which can no longer be identified. I see. All right. Anyway, let's leave it. But it was not only in this particular that things were changed. Hidetada had determined to suppress Christianity. Since the first arrival of the Portuguese Jesuits, followed by the rapid conversion of whole districts in the western and southern parts of Japan, there had been no systematic attempt to stifle the new religion. The story told of Nobunaga that when he was urged to expel the Roman Catholic missionaries, he remarked that as there were already 35 religious sects in Japan, a 36th could not make much difference, reflects the ease with which Christianity made its way in the country. And the same ruler's policy of tolerating the new tenets, articles of belief, while persecuting the Buddhist faith, gave them time to root and flourish. A sudden edict of Taiko-sama expelling the Jesuits from the kingdom was not enforced to the utmost, and Ieyasu generally left them in peace, although Towards the end of his reign, fresh edicts of banishment were issued, and the sentence to a considerable extent carried into effect. But many priests still lurked in the country, and COCKS notices that the hostility shown to some of his men by the natives of Omura was by means of the padres or priests who stirred them up against us to make us odious to the Japons, for they are all, or the most part, papistical Christians in Umbra, and attribute a great or chief occasion of banishment of them out of Japan by means of the English, many papists and Jesuits lying secretly lurking in most parts of Japan until this hour. Volume 1, page 139. While COCKS was waiting in Yedo for the copy of the privileges, he tells us that the council sent above 20 times to question him about the religion of the English, and were hardly persuaded that Protestants were distinct from Roman Catholics. Even Adams, at whose home some Spaniards were staying, was suspected of harbouring priests and received warning. These things indicated, as the Secretary Oyendono admitted, that the new ruler meant indeed to utterly extinguish the Jesuits and friars out of Japan, and there was good reason to believe that Christians of all sects would soon go the same way. The immediate result of this severity is seen soon after in the announcement on the 22nd of May of the next year of the execution of a Franciscan and a Jesuit, and other persecutions followed afterwards. Before COCKS returned to Hirado, he visited William Adams's estate at Hemi, which had been bestowed on him by Ieyasu. I suppose it was pronounced Febe when it should be Hemi. Yeah. There is, he says, describing it, above 100 farms or households upon it, besides others under them, all which are his vassals, and he hath power of life and death over them, they being his slaves, and he has absolute authority over them as any Tono or king in Japan hath over his vassals. Volume 1, page 181. On their way back to Hirado, they passed the site of Yoritomo's city of Kamakura, but now at present it is no city but scattered houses, seated here and there in pleasant valleys betwixt divers mountains, wherein are divers pagods very sumptuous, and a nunnery of shaven women. I did never see such pleasant walks among pine and spruce trees as there are about these pagodas. This is the one place in all Japan whose natural beauty seems to have impressed even the matter-of-fact COCKS, who could dismiss the Hakone Pass with its fine lake and scenery in the one sentence, Hakone on top of the mountain where the great pond with the devil is, as they report. The altered state of feelings at Yedo began soon to be reflected at Hirado. At the beginning of the new year, the king showed a disposition to meddle in the affairs of the English trade and betrayed ill humour in several small matters, and soon there were rumours that both English and Dutch would have to shift to other quarters. These disagreements drew a formal remonstrance from COCKS, who, entering into consideration of the small respect this king of Hirado hath of us in comparison of that which he had at our first entrance into Japan, expressed his discontent in a large letter, which, however, was received in good part and a friendly message returned. But after this, things never went quite so smoothly as before. Other troubles also began to close in on the English. Their relations with the Dutch were gradually becoming more and more estranged, until their differences culminated in open rupture. In 1617, rumours reached Hirado of Dutch outrages on the English in Puloe, which tended to increase the coolness so rapidly growing between the members of the English and Dutch factories, who, as the Japanese observed, were friends, but from tooth outwards. The frequent piracies of the Dutch upon the Chinese are reflected on by COCKS, who also accuses them of gross cruelty to their prisoners. An aggravation of these crimes was the fact that they were committed, if not under the English flag, at least under the English name, the Dutch giving out that they were English. Their success in this form of deception is illustrated by an entry in the diary. These Chinese in the junk just captured will not be persuaded but that they are Englishmen which took them. It was then with only an outward show of friendship that the two nations carried on their trade in Firando. In August of this year, the advice arrived from Bantam and about the same time Adams returned from a voyage to Cochinchina. Another journey to court immediately followed, and this time no farther than Fushimi near Miyako. Fushimi is part of Kyoto now, whither the shogun had come to visit the Mikado, the emperor. A renewed attempt, however, on the part of COCKS to obtain an extension of the privileges, the principal object of the journey, failed altogether. At first, indeed, the right to trade in Nagasaki was added, but in an evil hour one of the councillors took exception and this concession was cancelled. An answer was refused to a letter of James I, which was now presented, on the ground that it was addressed to the dead shogun Ieyasu, and that it was held ominous amongst the Japanese to answer to dead men's letters. In the end, poor Cox was, as he said, put to Hodgson's choice. That surely is Hobson's choice. And had to take what privileges he could, or none at all. So he got out our goshons, but the privileges as they were the last year. Worry, worry, worry. In fact, the Japanese themselves saw the advantages to be derived from trade, and the shogun very naturally would have his own vassals to get the benefit to bring up merchandise rather than strangers. The result was that a company of native merchants appeared in the market and formed, if we may judge by Cox's account of them, what would now be called a ring. A monopoly, yeah. It was on the occasion of this visit to court that Cox and his fellow travellers came in contact with a Korean embassy, to which he refers several times. The object of their mission, we are told, was to pay a visit of ceremony to the sepulchre of Ieyasu and to congratulate the new shogun upon his peaceful succession. Nothing eventful occurred at the factory in the early part of 1618. During a visit to Nagasaki in February and March, Cox made several interesting references to the Christians whom he had met among the natives, and on his arrival at this half-Christianized town, the Chinese junks, which were dressed with flags in his honour, flew the cross of St. George among the rest. Before Hoyne's death at Hirado, the English had been compelled to haul down their flag on account of the Christian symbol that it bore. Meanwhile, however, on the north of Kyushu, bloody persecutions were being carried on. And a little later it is recorded that the news of the crucifixion of some 37 men and women in Kokura. That's in Kee-tah-kew-shoo, where I live now. Crucifixion, goodness. Disquieting rumours were also afloat of a confederacy of the southern daimyos against the shogun. Soon, however, occurred an event which concerned the English more nearly than the political state of Japan. On the 8th of August, to their intense indignation, this is 1618, a Dutch ship arrived at Hirado bringing in as prize the English ship Attendance, which had been captured in the Moluccas. To do him justice, the Dutch factor Speck seems to have regretted the action and offered to restore her, but not, as Cox remarks, before there had been time to empty her. An immediate journey to court naturally followed in order to put in a written protest against this proceeding of the Dutch. But Cox was told that for facts committed in other places, the emperor would not meddle with it, so that, but for the easing of his conscience afforded by the delivery of his protest and the pleasure of some sightseeing, he might as well have remained at Hirado. For nearly the whole of the year 1619 and 1620, the diary is wanting, not available. And during the early part of this period, the Dutch were masters of the sea and the English in Japan were completely isolated. But in order to maintain their interests in the east, the English company had already, in 1617, dispatched a fleet of 5 ships under command of Captain Martin Pring. He reached Bantam in the middle of 1618 and, sailing thence to Jakarta, had news of the Dutch attack on the English in the Moluccas. He was soon after joined at Bantam by a reinforcement of 6 large ships under Sir Thomas Dale, who assumed the command of the combined fleet. After some skirmishing, the English retired to India to refit, and there Dale died. Pring then again sailed eastward, but finding himself outnumbered by the Dutch, he was on the point early in 1620 of dividing his forces and himself sailing for Japan, when he received news of the union of the English and Dutch companies. Thus relieved from fear of attack, he proceeded on his voyage and reached Hirado in safety. How the English fared in Hirado during these 2 years, we learn from COCKS's letters to the company. Uh, in the determined attack which the Dutch made on the English factory, there can be little doubt that had not the Japanese protected them, our countrymen would have fallen victims to the Hollanders, who, by sound of trumpet, aboard all their ships in the harbour of Hirado, proclaimed open wars against our English nation, both by sea and land, with fire and sword, to take our ships and goods and destroy our persons to the uttermost of their power, as to their mortal enemies. But in the midst of these troubles there was a gleam of light in trade prospects, for the shogun was at least induced early in 1620 to allow Nagasaki to be included in the English privileges. The advantages of that port, with its fine harbour over the poor fisher town of Firando, with its bad anchorage, are duly set forth by COCKS, and we learn at the same time the reasons why the larger town was not selected at first, which heretofore was not thought fit, because then a papist Portugal's bishop lived in the town, and there was 10 or 12 parish churches besides monasteries. But now all was changed. Churches and monasteries had been levelled with the earth, and even graveyards uprooted, and all the dead men's bones taken out of the ground and cast forth. The news of the union of the two companies will account for the English still remaining in their old quarters in Hirado, to keep near the Dutch instead of migrating to Nagasaki. Death had also in this interval brought misfortunes to the English factory. The first loss was that of Huau, the Chinaman, upon whom COCKS so much relied to obtain privileges for the China trade. Then Nielsen died in March 1620, and last of all, our good friend Captain William Adams, who was so long before us in Japan, departed out of this world on the 16th of May last. If for no other reason, we must, on Adams' account, deplore the loss of COCKS's diary for this period, which would undoubtedly have contained some details of his last illness and death. It is also to be regretted that we do not find more personal details about Adams in the portions of the diary which have survived. But he was so often absent on trading voyages and other business that COCKS must be excused if he tells us no more than he does. As already noticed, the Cape merchant held him in some awe, and if we may believe the diary, Adams was inclined to be somewhat hasty in temper. On the other hand, he did the company good and faithful service, and to judge by small things, the reader will not fail to notice the patience with which he waited, time after time, on the dilatory pleasure of court officials in the interest of the English. His influence with the shoguns is more than once referred to. The Emperor Ieyasu, writes COCKS in 1616, esteemeth him much, and he may go and speak with him at all times, when kings and princes are kept out. And again in 1620, I cannot but be sorrowful for the loss of such a man as Captain William Adams was, he having been in such favour with the two emperors of Japan as never was any Christian in these parts of the world, and might freely have entered and had speech with the emperors when many Japon kings stood without and could not be permitted. Japon daimyo, that is, yeah, Japanese daimyo. Adams had a wife and daughter living in England. He also had a son and daughter in Japan. To all of these, he left his property in equal shares. References are several times made to the disposal of his goods and to the transmission of money to England, as well as to difficulties arising from the disposition of certain goshons or trading licenses belonging to his children in Japan. And footnote 2 is about Adams's will. Okay. The result in Japan of this union of the English and Dutch companies was, as we have seen, that the English factory remained at Hirado instead of removing to the far more commodious town of Nagasaki. A combined fleet of English and Dutch ships, sailing under the modest name of the Fleet of Defence, was equipped for the purpose of damaging the common enemy and of diverting the trade of China from the Philippine Islands to the Dutch and English settlements. In other words, to blockade the Spanish and Portuguese ports and seize as many of the Chinese trading junks as possible. In the two expeditions to the Philippines undertaken by the fleet before the English and Dutch again separated, they captured many prizes. and the Dutch are said to have treated their Chinese prisoners with great cruelty while their new allies interfered to protect these unfortunate people. All the time, however, that the English were thus engaged at sea, peaceful negotiations were still being carried on by COCKS for establishing trade with China, though it is not surprising that our joining with the Hollanders to take China junks is ill thought of. In 1621, the English at Hirado, apparently with the idea that trade was now going to flourish, built a new warehouse and wharves and undertook other works on a large scale, but it was impossible that their relations with the Dutch could be cordial, and dissensions soon broke out. There was ill blood between the sailors of the two nations. In the Philippines, they could scarcely be restrained from fighting, and when, at the end of June, the fleet returned to Hirado and the crews got ashore, they at once came to blows, and a Dutchman was killed. Then followed the trial and execution of the English sailor who had killed him, and this temper in which his shipmates regarded his condemnation, may be judged from the fact that Captain Robert Adams was forced to put the rope about his neck with his own hands. And it was not only with the English that the Dutch sailors quarrelled. They were drunken and riotous and brabbled in the streets, till at last the long-suffering Japanese lost patience and, seizing two of them, summarily cut off their heads. The English too demanded a victim. A Dutchman who had stabbed an Englishman was condemned and executed by his own countrymen in a novel fashion, they having first made the man so drunk that he could scarce stand on his legs, and so cut off his head within their own house. As to the crews of the English shipping, they were perhaps only a degree less turbulent. To maintain discipline and set an example, 4 runaways were condemned and hanged. Gosh. In 1620, the English ship Elizabeth, cruising off the island of Formosa, that's Taiwan. Formosa is Portuguese for beautiful, beautiful island. So, captured a Japanese vessel on her way from the Philippines to Japan. On board were found 2 priests who, in the end, proved to be Pedro de Zuniga, an Augustinian, and Luis Flores, a Dominican. They long denied their names, and we find many references in the diary to their examination at Hirado. It was an object to the English and Dutch to convict them, as in such one case the ship became good prize. In the end, these 2 unfortunate men, together with the Japanese captain of the vessel, were, in 1622, put to death by the horrible torture of slow fire, and the crew were beheaded, so that we cannot much regret that the captors were balked of their prize. There is an account of their martyrdom in Pages, Histoire de la religion chrétienne au Japon. With grim humour, the shogun appropriated the cargo for himself, leaving the rotten hull for us and the Hollanders. So much against their will, the factors had to deliver over the prize goods after a little hesitation, which, however, they saw it was useless to persist in, when COCKS was told that they would take it whether we would or no, and that if we had not absolutely proved the Portingals to be padres, the Emperor meant to have put Captain Leonard Camps and me to death, and to have seized on all we had in the country, and if any resistance had been made, to have burned all our shipping and put us all to the sword. Volume 2, page 335. So the shogun is not messing around. At the end of 1621, COCKS set out on the last visit to the court at Yedo, recorded in his diary, the English and their Dutch allies now going in one company. Speck was no longer at the head of the Dutch factory. He had left Japan in the previous October, his successor being Leonard Camps, who was now Cox's travelling companion. After delivering the customary presents and after the usual long delay in getting leave to depart, they were dismissed without the shogun's return gifts, which were not ready, which truly is the greatest wrong or indignity that ever hitherto was offered to any Christians. It is almost unnecessary to add that COCKS and Camps quarrelled. The diary ends on the 24th of March 1622, in the middle of the journey back to Hirado, and in the last entry, COCKS tells us how the Hollanders slipped away from him. No phrase could better express the whole course of the dealings of the Dutch with the English in Japan. The rest of the story of the English factory is soon told. The Council of Defence of the East India Company at Batavia had some time before determined to reduce it to small dimensions. In his letter of the 7th of September 1622, COCKS records the receipt of orders to leave off our consort ship of the fleet of defence with the Hollanders and to send our 5 ships for Jakarta with as much speed as conveniently we could. All money and merchandise was to be withdrawn except a small cargizon or stock worth 5,000 taels to be left in charge of Osterwijk and a couple of assistants, and Cox, Eaton and Sayers were to come along in the said ships for Jakarta for lessening charges in the factory. All which directions the Cape merchant piously assured the company should be followed as near as we can, but nevertheless stayed where he was. The difficulty, however, of getting payment of outstanding debts was at least some excuse, and he still fondly clung to the hopes of the China trade. While the English were thus yielding ground, their Dutch rivals were more energetic than ever. They had failed in an attempt to surprise Macau, but had forcibly established themselves in the Pescadore Islands, and they still persisted in their old offence of passing for Englishmen. It was only a few months later that the Amboina massacre was perpetrated. At last, at a consultation of the council at Batavia on the 25th of April 1623, the dissolution of the English factory in Japan was formally decided. Captain Joseph Cockram was dispatched in the ship Bull, invested with full powers. It was, however, left to his discretion to allow 2 juniors to remain to collect debts if there were any prospect of recovery. He arrived at Hirado in July, bearing a letter dated 22nd of May from the council, directing all the members of the factory to come away from thence upon the ship Bull for Batavia, hereby charging you and every of you to fulfill our said order, as you will answer the contrary at your perils. Cox is ordered to get all the debts he can, and he is blamed in severe terms for the loss of the great sums which he had advanced for the China trade. The China no Keda, that's Andrew Dittis. This word is also written in other letters, no Kada and Nakauda, and appears to be the Japanese word nakodo, go-between or agent, hath too long deluded you through your own simplicity to give credit unto him. You have lived long enough in these parts to be better experienced of the fraudulent practices of those people. The English buildings at Hirado are to be handed over to the king to hold in trust until such time as we shall send thither again to repossess the same. And so, after some other orders, the letter concludes with a caustic admonition that because last year, to serve your own turn, you made what construction you pleased of our commission for your coming from thence, we do now iterate our commission in the conclusion of our letter, lest having read it to the former part thereof, you should forget it before you come to the end. Preparations for departure were at once made. The ostensible reasons given to the King of Hirado being the loss of ships and the bad prospects of the China trade, and not out of any unkind usage here in his Majesty's the Shogun's dominions. But anxious as they now were to shake themselves free of Japan, the factors were still obliged to send up one of their number, Richard Hudson, to deliver the customary present to the Shogun, so that it was not till nearly the end of the year that they were ready to quit Hirado. On the 16th of December, in consultation, it was determined to leave no one behind to collect debts, but the Dutch factor was empowered to receive any sums that might come in. The amount owing to the factory was 12,821 taels, about £3,200, out of which Dittis was answerable for 6,636 taels, or £1,659. The following abstract of a lost portion of Cox's diary gives us particulars of the last days spent by the English in Japan. So this is an abstract copy of some passages at our leaving Japan and dissolving the English factory at Hirado in the year 1623, taken out of Mr. Richard Cock, his journal, who was chief these 11 or 12 years. All right. I don't know that I shall read all of that, but anyway. Uh, the bull reached Batavia on the 27th of January, 1624. And now poor Cox was indeed in trouble. In their letter of the 24th February to the East India Company, the Council of Defence accuse him of culpable carelessness, that he neither kept the accounts himself nor appointed others to do so, that he disobeyed orders in not leaving Japan the year before, that he made a desperate debt of 5,000 taels with the China captain, and that he had brought a store of trash and lumber from Japan. No consultations had been kept, nor decorum nor order observed. They were tempted to deal severely with him and send him home as a malefactor. But having consideration for his age and position, and allowing for his bad health and testy and wayward disposition, and being also persuaded that harsh treatment might shorten his life, they left him to be dealt with by the company, the East India Company in London, only ordering his goods to be seized on his arrival in England. Thus, in disgrace and broken in health, Cox went on board the Anne Royal and on the 24th of February sailed for England. I feel rather sorry for him. But he was not to see his country again. A month later, on the 27th of March, he died at sea and was buried under a discharge of ordnance. No doubt many of the charges brought against Cox were true. Traces of confusion in his money accounts are to be found in his diary, and he was too easy-going for the position of head of a factory which had so many obstacles in the way of its development. There can be no question of his want of firmness, his many quarrels with companions and subordinates, and the somewhat helpless way in which he records them afford sufficient indications of this failing. But he was perfectly honest. He died poor, and his very weaknesses render him a not unamusing diarist. This last qualification makes us his friend, and we cannot accompany him through these pages without feeling goodwill towards him. We note his quaint phrases, his sharp eye for tricks and legerdemain of enemies, or for the playing the Gemini of doubtful friends. How this man is angry and takes pepper in the nose, while another loses temper and takes a proposal in snuff, and a third in a rage falls into terms. And we see him reduced to Hodgson's choice long before he ought to be, if Cambridge Hobson gave his name to the proverb. Yeah. Yes, Hobson's choice, not Hodgson's choice. He had a taste for planting and gardening. He grew the first potatoes in Japan. Forget not my pigeons and fishes is an injunction in one of his letters when away from home. His goldfish, presents from China, were dearly prized and not willingly given away to the great men in Hirado who coveted them. All these are pleasant traits. Nor was he, though unlettered and a little unsteady when he quoted Latin without some taste for books. He had a Turkish history and a St. Augustine City of God to lend a friend, Volume 1, page 118, and he received a present of an English book of essays, Volume 1, page 230. But we need not assume that he had read Chaucer, because he calls a long rambling statement a Canterbury Tale, Volume 1, page 282. His property was only worth 1,500 reals, about £300, but, in accordance with the advice of the Council of Defence quoted above, it was seized on the arrival of the Anne Royal in England. We learn from the minutes of the East India Company that a petition was afterwards presented respecting Cox's small estate. There is the petition. In the end, the money was paid over by the company to Cox's relatives. Scarcely anything was ever recovered from the debts owing to the company in Japan. The council at Batavia, writing home on the 6th of February 1626, announced that the Dutch factor at Hirado had informed them of the death of the Chinaman Andrea Dittis, who had left only a small estate to satisfy his creditors, out of which the company was to receive its share. All other debts were bad, and no return was to be expected but by mere accident. Thus was severed our connection with Japan, not to be reunited until our own day. That's the 1850s onwards. But the reoccupation of our factory was often proposed and more than once attempted. Even when writing their letter just referred to, the council at Batavia spoke of it. Again in 1627 they proposed it. In 1633 a freeman of the company named Smithick again raised the question, and again in 1635 it was debated. In 1658, the company actually fitted 3 ships to reopen the trade, but the lateness of the season and the prospect of a Dutch war caused them to abandon the expedition. In 1664, the company again seriously thought of the undertaking and wrote to Bantam for information respecting the late settlement at Hirado. And it is remarkable that so soon after our retirement so little was remembered. The reply was that, "In this factory here is not the least remembrance of your servants acting in Japan formerly. Only your agent hath procured a journal of a voyage made thither in 1615, but it mentions only the acting of the mariner, nothing of the factor." In 1668, a committee was appointed to consider how trade could be reopened, and in the next year inquiries were again addressed to Bantam. From thence was announced a rumour that the Dutch had tried to purchase the English buildings at Hirado but were refused by the daimyo, who was in expectation of our return. In 1670, the ship Advance was sent out to Bantam to be used in reopening trade, if thought convenient, but she was dispatched to Persia. But in 1671, 2 ships, the Crown and Bantam, were actually commissioned to make a voyage from Bantam to Taiwan and thence to Nagasaki. The supercargoes receiving instructions to find out where the English formerly resided at Hirado and why they were removed. These vessels were lost. The same year, the agent at Bantam reported that there are some Scotch, Irish, etc. there at Hirado, although we know not by what occasion there, an interesting remark, probably referring to descendants of the old settlers. At last the matter was seriously taken in hand, and ships were dispatched from England in 1672 with a letter from Charles II to the Emperor of Japan, every care being taken to escape the attention of the Dutch. Those wary traders, however, did not fail to discover the English designs, so that when at length the ship Return arrived at Nagasaki on the 29th of June 1673, it was found that her coming was expected. The crew were well treated and allowed provisions, while a message was dispatched to the shogun, but the newcomers were closely watched and sharply questioned about their religion. Again, as in Cox's days, the cross of St. George in the English flag gave trouble. It is interesting to find it noticed that one of his old interpreters was still living. At last, on the 28th of July, the shogun's decision was announced. The Dutch had taken care to inform the Japanese of Charles's marriage with a princess of the Roman Catholic family of Portugal, and the shogun refused to accept the friendship of one who had allied himself with the daughter of the enemies of Japan. So the Return sailed away on the 28th of August, and after this only indirect attempts to open negotiations by the mediation of the princes of Bantam, Amoy, Taiwan, Tonkin, and Siam were made in 1681 and 1683. The social relations of the English with their Japanese neighbours were on the whole friendly. Periodical exchanges of presents and courtesies were the rule, although an occasional quarrel or street row was only to be expected where so many elements of turbulence were present in drunken sailors and factorymen. The domestic arrangements of the English are patent enough in the pages of the diary and appear to have given no offence to the natives. Only on one occasion do we read of rhymes cast abroad and sung up and down against the native women at the English factory, which moreover Cox attributed to the instigation of the Dutch, songs having been made against them to like effect before, but not against us. They were even allowed to hold slaves, although they were afterwards forbidden to export them. They also appear to have kept on good terms with the princes of the neighbouring provinces, the daimyo of Satsuma being specially noted for his friendliness. The Dutch, on the other hand, were not so conciliatory, and we have seen that the natives of Hirado sided with the English against them when they attacked the English factory. But they were richer and could afford handsomer presents, and thus had always friends at court. Many of the notices of native customs are interesting. The reader will at once remark several instances of the Japanese severity in punishing offences which our modern code regards as comparatively trivial. Death was the penalty for the most petty theft. Cox tells us of a boy of 16 who was cut in pieces with great cruelty for stealing a little boat and taking it to another island, and again of a man who was roasted to death running around about a post, fire being made about him, the offence being also theft of a small bark of little or no value. Volume 1, page 291. A curious form of degradation is mentioned in connection with an execution on a certain occasion, where the brother of a criminal had the lock of his hair cut off by the hangman with the same katan, the same sword, which cut his brother in pieces. Volume 1, page 156. The difference in European and Japanese ideas of justice was well exemplified when the Dutch factor, complaining of an assault on one of his countrymen, demanded that the parties which offered the abuse might be brought to the place where they did it and be beaten with cudgels, at which the king smiled and said it could not be, but if he would have them cut in pieces, he would do it. Gosh. The custom of suicide of friends and retainers at the funeral of a great man is referred to more than once. Saris mentions the mint-master of Ieyasu as one that hath vowed that, whensoever the emperor shall die, he will cut his own guts and die with him. This is, well, in 1912, General Nogi followed the Meiji emperor in committing suicide. So that was, this is another example of that, an earlier example. No doubt he was one of the two nobles who killed themselves to accompany Ogosho-sama in another world, as they think, and whose monument COCKS saw at Yedo in 1618. In his letter of 10th December 1614, COCKS also reports that, at the death of old Hoin-sama, Ushian Dono, his governor, and two other servants cut their bellies to bear him company, and in the curious account of the funeral of Hoin's brother in 1621, we are told that one boss or priest hanged himself in a tree hard by the place of funeral. For bozes may not cut their bellies, but hang themselves they may. Some of the dead man's servants, too, were only restrained from self-sacrifice by the king's orders, and many others, his friends, cut off the two foremost joints of their little fingers and threw them into the fire to be burned with the corpse. Volume 2, page 202. The practice of harakiri, or self-destruction to avoid disgrace, is mentioned as occurring at Hirado on two occasions. Volume 1, page 337, Volume 2, page 136. A few other points of interest may be noticed. The spread of Christianity through the southern and western provinces has already been referred to. The mother of the king of Hirado is called a papistical Jesuit, and he and the rest of his brethren and sisters papistical Christians. Volume 2, page 250. Again, at the funeral of Hoin's brother, mentioned above, it was said that a log of wood was substituted for the real body and burned, for he was thought to be a Christian. Volume 2, page 201. On the other hand, it seems that the Japanese would not admit into their faith perverts from Christianity, for an Englishman went and cut his hair after the pagan fashion, thinking to turn pagan, which he could not do here, although he would. Volume 1, page 179. The changing of names, which gives so much trouble in reading Japanese history, is often mentioned. Figena-sama is at first called Tome-sama, and some of his relatives appear suddenly under new names in 1621, Volume 2, page 169. The kabokes, or dancing bears, as COCKS calls them, that is, the dancing women or players, and their male companions, are present at every large entertainment mentioned in the diary. And lastly, the readiness of the Japanese to adopt foreign customs is curiously exemplified in the rapidity with which tobacco smoking spread among the people. It is strange, says COCKS, writing in 1615, to see how these Japons, men, women, and children, are besotted in drinking that herb, and not 10 years since it was in use first. When once the habit had got such a hold, no measures for the destruction of the plant could change it. The drinking inevitably went on, and in 1619 the burning of half a town is ascribed to it. In conclusion, I should mention that one of the chief difficulties with which I have had to contend in editing these volumes has been that of finding explanations of the foreign words and terms in the diary. COCKS adopted words from other languages besides Japanese, and generally wrote them down as they sounded. Hence, it was no easy matter for one ignorant of Eastern languages to decide whether particular words thus disguised are Japanese or of some other tongue, and I fear that I have too often taxed the patience and good nature of my Orientalist friends for solutions of these difficulties. It is with pleasure that I take this opportunity of thanking Dr. William Anderson, whose knowledge of the language of Japan is so extensive, and my colleagues Dr. Charles Ryu and Professor R.K. Douglas, Robert Kenaway Douglas, that is, for much valuable assistance. I also gratefully acknowledge kind help and many courtesies from Mr. Charles C. Prinsep, Superintendent of the Records, and Mr. Edward J. Wade, Assistant Librarian in the India Office, and from Mr. W. Noel Sainsbury of the Public Record Office. British Museum, 30th of December, 1882. And after that, there's an interesting, what we'd call a glossary, some Japanese and other foreign words and terms. So, bongu, Japanese bugyo, a superintendent, or a magistrate, I suppose. Japanese bozu, a Buddhist priest, the word bozu in Japanese now. Bubes or biobs, Japanese byobu, screens or pictures. Yes, byobu still exists as a word in Japanese. Kaboke, Japanese kabu, singing and dancing, a dancing girl. Kalambak is aloe wood. Cape merchant from the Spanish cabo, head merchant. Captain Mor, Portuguese, Capitão Mor, captain in chief. Katabra, Japanese katabira, a summer robe. Katan is Japanese katana, a sword. Cho is Japanese cha, tea. Chon, a lot of land or house. Dairi, Japanese, the Mikado. Danko, Japanese, consultation. Fana, Japanese hana, a present to a dancing girl. Fibak, silver once refined. Foifone, Japanese fune, a boat. Furo, Japanese furo, a bathroom. Futaki, Japanese hotoke, an idol, a temple. Gadong or gedong, Bengali gudam, a shop or a warehouse. In fact, go down is a word which has come into English, or came into English around this time, meaning warehouse, and was used in some contemporary writing. Goka, Japanese koku, is a dish. Goshon, Japanese gosha, a pass or license. Jurebaso, an interpreter, I think from Portuguese. Kerimon, Japanese keromo, is a robe. Quitesol, Spanish quitasol, a parasol. Langanak, Japanese naginata, a lance or halberd. Makari, Japanese makie, lacquer. Morofak, a spirit or wine. Muchie, Japanese mochi, a cake. It's a rice cake, isn't it? Neremon, Japanese norimono, a sedan chair. Nihon katange, Japanese katachi, after fashion of Japan. Ropsbake, Japanese rokushaku, a chair bearer. Sappon, a kind of wood. Sekanseke, Japanese sakazuke, a cup. Sing, a wine. Soma, a junk. Somo, double refined silver. Tabi, Japanese, a stocking. Tatami, Japanese tatami, a mat or a measure. Tono, Japanese, a lord or a petty king. And wakadash, Japanese wakizashi, a short sword or dagger. Okay, good. So really, that is it. I'm very glad that there is a glossary. It's quite useful when you're reading these old diaries. I'm going to stop the share now. Yeah, I've now read the whole of the preface to Edward Maund Thompson's edition, 1883 edition of the Diary of Richard Cox. And I thought it was rather well done, I have to say, although, of course, superseded in some respects. And I hope you enjoyed it as well. And I will leave it here. Thank you very much for watching, if you have done so until this point.